My name is Jack Pizzo. I'm the president of Pizzo and Associates, and I'm the glass half full guy in here because I'm a restoration ecologist. I go out and I see the actual ecosystems restoring. So I get to see the positive results every day. And to that end, being a businessman, there are opportunities to be made, or there is money to be made in these ecological opportunities. So one thing that struck me, because I happen to know Don and the Water Reclamation District, was you showed that they could save $1 billion, no small amount of money, in doing ecosystem services by nutrient farming. And that is an individual case, or that is an individual case. And are there any other nutrients, not just the nitrogen, but that you value in that system on the Illinois River?
Well, there are a number of other contaminants that we've been trying to deal with. How's that? There are a number of other contaminants in the Illinois River that we have tried dealing with in the past that would be very nicely managed by wetlands. Atrazine is an example. Wetlands are very successful in taking atrazine out of the water. The pharmaceuticals, we don't know a whole lot about the various pharmaceuticals running down the river, but we suspect if there's any organic component to it, that the microbes in the wetland will be able to decompose those molecules as well. We didn't talk very much about sediment, but sediment storage would be another ecosystem services that could be provided. I mentioned flood storage, and it's interesting that the ecosystem service of flood storage has been around for a long time, and the Army Corps of Engineers actually paid for that service. In Kansas, when they built a bunch of reservoirs for flood storage, they went out and they paid the riparian landowners for the right to flood their land. The landowners gave them a flood easement for which the Army Corps paid money. And of course, one little bar on that income side to nutrient farming was recreation. Hunting license today are very, sought after. That's a good phrase.
Any other comments from the panelists about economic values of the...
I can imagine that, you heard about problems and you heard solutions from the ecologists, and what's limiting? How come we're not just jumping on this and we're going to say the economics is the problem? And in the afternoon, hopefully we can find the right policy framework to make the solutions sort of an economic reality. But I was pretty impressed with all the talks this morning that there are a lot of solutions hanging around out there. So
now, let me respond to your comment on that. What we've been looking for are both sides of the economic ledger. We have wetlands as a producer. Landowners who grow wetlands and harvest nitrogen and phosphorus, they're producers of credit. And we have an identified demand for credits. And there's some 316 point source systems within the Illinois basin. So there are a lot of buyers. So we have a demand and we have a supply. Now that is an economic system. Mm-hmm. What we have to do is we have to get that in play, and that we don't have. And that's a sociological problem that was raised last evening in the lecture. That's a problem of our society being willing to put that market into play.
Patty?
Yeah, I happen to have a friend who's a farmer and read some of his farm journals from time to time. And I was really surprised to read about a case study of, sort of a illustrative example of a family farm that was farming for carbon credits as well as corn by using no-till production, et cetera, and making a good living at that. And I think that getting that message out to family farms as well as, factory farms and having that be subsidized is an important piece.
And it's not like you're talking about a new subsidy. I mean, they already subsidize the price supports, which is just yield at no cost, no environmental cost. And so we're just talking about really a new farm bill.
Right.
Would you pay for ecological performance?
Right, exactly. Probably better in the long run, both socially as well as economically to have subsidies for things like carbon than it is for commodities.
I would
ultimately.
object strenuously to the subsidy argument. And I think it's absolutely unnecessary at this point. I think if we create a real market, people will take their land and put it into ecosystem services as long as they can sell them. You don't need the federal government subsidizing it. And in the economic analysis that we looked at, if we could eliminate the subsidies on corn production in the floodplain of our rivers,
Right.
we would create a net social benefit of $500 million a year in the upper 5 states of the Mississippi River.
I think subsidies can be a bad word or knee-jerk, but really, Patty, my interpretation is we have this, the government has to enforce and issue these credits, right? Somebody has to come around and make sure that they're available, that they're being changed,
You have
that
to have
you're
an
actually
oversight.
delivering. You
That's
need
right.
oversight.
You need
right.
some sort of money, but you know, our stock exchange, the commodity exchange in Chicago, they look at the quality of the soybeans that are sold, they issue the certificates. That kind of governance is undoubtedly going to be required.
I'm going to suggest I want to put you out of business. And one way is we need to create the crops that have the traits in them that are not addicted to nitrogen supply rates that allow for non-point source pollution. And part of the problem is that there is essentially no research going on for below ground traits in plants. When you start going through the literature, and I've collected basically every paper that has ever been produced in the area, it fills a notebook. And so then I say, well, let me expand the search a little more, and but what it's coming down to is that it's a wide open area. But the problem is we wouldn't even know what traits we even want. Do we want to have a lot of very fine roots that turn over quickly, and by doing so put a lot of carbon into the system? Or do we want to have a lot of coarse roots with lots of mycorrhizal fungi out there doing the work? I can't tell you in the long run which is the best approach. Do we want to try to manage for asymbiotic nitrogen fixation? Things like that. But the problem is that it's a very difficult area of research. But right now we're dealing with the success of the green revolution that's based on fertilizers and chemicals. And today, a few companies own all of it.
Now, are you going to also take out the cities? Maybe we should have a new human being that doesn't excrete. Period. Now think of that.
I've tried that, but it doesn't work.
Right, yeah.
The biggest battles I've had have been trying to save the few open spaces that we have. And my neighbors will tell it's special, and I say there's nothing special about that woodlot. What's special about it is it still exists.
That's
Hold
special. But you know
on.
why they're
Jason,
not-
why don't you jump in here? Because if you get corn production for ethanol that's inefficient, now economically inefficient, and we move to the fuels that you showed, they're going to need less nitrogen, right? And so maybe Don's going to supply the credits for humans, and we can fix the ag system in another way.
But let me
Otherwise, we're
respond.
just spinning the nitrogen
Let me
cycle.
respond to his business about cellulose or taking the stover off the land. You're reducing the carbon content of the soil. In the 93 flood, nearly half of the floodwaters that caused $16 billion worth of damage could have been stored in the soil had they had the carbon content. We don't have it. So I think in the short run, what I would propose and respond to Mike over here wants to put me out of business, that in the short run, we go the direction of nutrient farming or something of the sort, because it's a very flexible program. If the price of corn and soybeans go up, you trade out of nutrient farming and you go into corn and soybean production. If you can figure out a better way of growing corn, and there's a guy out in Kansas that has been working for years on perennial grasses. And so far we haven't seen it, but maybe with perennial grasses, we wouldn't have to have so much nitrogen. But we still have floodwaters. I suspect we will.
I would agree with him and say that I would be happy to be out of business as a restoration ecologist, because then that means we've got, almost everything restored. Until then, we are going to need these business solutions. But I'd like to open it up to the audience and have any questions.
Yeah, thank you. John Coos, Center for Sustainable Enterprise, Chicago. You got a microphone coming.
Bring it up. There you go.
Thank you. John Coos, Center for Sustainable Enterprise in Chicago at Stewart School of Business. Got a question for all of you, actually. Oh, the name of the gentleman was Wes Jackson at the Land Institute, which is a great intro to, I think, what we all need to talk about, and that's food policy or ag policy, whatever you choose to make it. Atrazine, you mentioned. In Europe, they don't use atrazine. We use 75 million tons of it in the U.S. in their agriculture. It's banned in Europe because of the, I'm not going to get into endocrine disruptors, go on and on and on. So we're using chemistry that we shouldn't be using, and we're basically treating symptoms of problems that we're continuing to create. So one of the things is maybe to go to perennial agriculture. But my question to your panel is how do we stop fixing problems and put in solutions that don't need fixing? All right, we need to fix the problems first, but if we continue to create the problems, we're going to continually be in this circle of fix, fix, fix. And to speak to some of the issues perhaps in terms of your own work, and I loved all your presentations. We can probably talk for 3 days on each of them.
I'll try to give a short answer. My feeling is local closed loop systems. We want to reduce the flows as much as we can and try to close those gaps, right? And so soaking up atrazine that's already out there, as well as trying to get it banned, is one example. Using less nitrogen and absorbing what comes off, that close to the pump. So, I mean, that's the short answer.
Local production, certainly, especially in terms of food production, is a better solution, less carbon, et cetera, et cetera. And unfortunately, as romantic a notion as perennial crops may be, the truth is that perennial species, by their nature, especially when you're talking about herbaceous species, don't tend to have the same level of yield as annuals. And so, although that may be the holy grail of agriculture, the yield limit is always going to be there, and it's biologically difficult, if not impossible, to surpass.
I think we also need to think about scale when we think about solutions. The problem is enormous. Illinois has the dubious distinction of being the highest producer of nitrogen runoff of all the states in the Mississippi Basin. They also happen to be the highest producer, we happen to be the highest producer of phosphorus of all the states tributary to the Gulf of Mexico. We'd have to remove something like 100,000 tons per year of nitrogen to get back to 1972 conditions, when presumably there was not hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. That's enormous. That's huge. We're not going to do it with our conventional treatment technology. It's too expensive.
Great. That's good. You have a question right there, ma'am?
First, let me give you a scenario, and then you can help me solve the problem. Let's talk about genetically engineered seeds. There is a huge amount of corn and soybeans that are now genetically engineered across the country and in Canada. After a period of time, whatever these genetically engineered seeds are supposed to do, nature gets very smart, and they begin to, and the plants begin to build resistance to whatever the genetic engineering demands. At which point, farmers, after 3 or 4 crops, are forced to go back, notwithstanding the promise that you don't have to use any more pesticides. The farmers are now forced to go back and buy from the same corporation massive amounts of pesticides to do the same thing that the genetically engineered seeds were supposed to do. What we are talking about, and I know farmers that have had to do this, is the use of 2,4-D, which is the other half of Agent Orange, and which contains dioxin. Now, you've got a Congress that is so involved with genetically engineered money that it's going to be a long time before we're going to get rid of something that is already showing serious human health effects, to say nothing of environmental effects. And I'm just going to dump this on you and ask you, how do we deal with it?
Well, strangely enough, I mean, when we think of genetic engineering, with sort of the science fiction, but all crops are genetically engineered. It's just the way that they're engineered. Some of them are engineered through more traditional methods of breeding, and some of them are engineered through inserting genes, single genes. And that's a difficult nut to crack, especially here in the U.S. And other than flat out banning some of those things or convincing farmers that economically it doesn't make sense, I'm not sure what the solution is.
I'd like to respond, though, with the thing you said. If you have a hybrid corn, what you're doing is breeding between corn families. If you genetically engineer, you're going to put a strawberry into something else, and it is a totally foreign substance, and it has never been done in nature before until you get to the laboratory.
Thank you.
Great.
Hi, I'm Laura Perner. I'm with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. I had asked the question about subsidies to the gentleman from Oregon during the break, and it says in some of the information on the speakers that you've talked to people in Washington about certain aspects of renewable energy, and so I really find it incongruous that we subsidize farmers to grow corn that is heavily dependent on fertilizers that contain nitrogen and phosphorus, that besmirch our rivers and are helping with Gulf hypoxia. And then basically what is done with these crops is they are burned and or destroyed. And further aggravating the tar out of me is the fact that farmers in central Illinois are being told to grow corn for ethanol production when Mr. Hill just told us that it's really not a very energy net positive process. So I see the public policy and what's actually happening on the ground having nothing to do with reality and future consequences and a realistic path towards a more sensible and viable energy future for this country. And I understand that the Farm Bureau in Illinois is extremely politically powerful, but there is such a disjunct that I just want somebody on the panel to tell me that there's hope, because I don't see a lot of hope, and I don't see a lot of realistic things and things that are short-term thinking is an ample supply. What I don't see is the long-term view.
Yeah, the only answer that I have to that is I really hope, like you do, that the change of administration might actually do some long-term good. One of the problems, especially over the past 8 years, is that science in general just was anathema to the administration, and that trickled down into all kinds of public policy. So all of the good science that everybody here has been talking about has not been integrated into public policy as a result.
And as a farmer, might not look like one. I own 80 acres out in DeKalb County. A recent study out there showed after 3 or 4 years, and if you email me, I'll get you the report, that organically grown corn actually yielded as much as traditionally grown corn. And without the price increase for organic yields. So there's some hope. And there are farmers like me who are putting conservation easements on their land and restoring the prairies and wetlands. So, ma'am?
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
That's okay. It's a quick one. Hi, Tina Yerkes from Ducks Unlimited. I wholeheartedly buy into the nutrient farming and the ability to trade not only water quality credits, but carbon credits to improve the stands here. The problem is the market doesn't exist. So how do you propose to create the market that is regulated and backed by authority to do so, particularly for non-point source trades?
The market can be created very quickly. All we need is the US EPA to set the standards or set the cap. You would get carbon credits and the demand for carbon credits by capping all the point source emissions of CO2 or even mobile sources of CO2. You'll certainly get a cap placed on wastewater treatment plants when you pass the water quality standards. Now that's sitting in the hands of the state. Being very slow about it, perhaps this group could draft a letter demanding that the state pass the standards. Or your organization could write the...
We have,
May I just jump?
Yeah, that's...
Sorry. May I jump in quickly to the last question here? If you look at what's happened with the indirect land use change debate over the last few years, I think there is hope. The EPA has come out and said that indirect land use change, it must be included. Obviously, you saw it in the wording that I put up from the Energy Independence and Security Act, but they went further and said it is the right thing to do from a science perspective. Now, the question is, what methods of accounting are they going to use now that they've accepted it's the correct thing to do, and how much resistance is there going to be from a legislative standpoint to this? Representative Peterson from Minnesota, head of the Ag Committee, chair of the Ag Committee, has said that he will oppose any climate legislation unless indirect land use change is dropped from the renewable fuel standard. And so do a little Googling on news stories for that. But that's an excellent case study to show the conflict that's going on now, as well as some hope that the current administration is going to take science more seriously.
Yeah.
Let's do one more question. So
Yeah.
we have another speaker. Just shout.
Elevate.
A little bit of good news. Not waiting for all kinds of major national legislation. 7 years ago, the state of Minnesota put a ban on phosphorus in its fertilizer. And as Minnesota often does, they realized that they needed to track it, and the results have been very good. The state is still green, people are still playing golf, the corn is still growing. And then this spring, the state of Wisconsin, by unanimous vote in both houses of its legislature, passed a similar ban on phosphorus in fertilizer. So I think that we need to not always be looking at grand designs, but realizing that when people really understand the problem and what some of the motivation and some of the solutions are, that they can take action.
Think globally, act locally.
Just what's interesting about adding phosphorus to the soil is what you do is you make nitrogen limited. So you have to add more nitrogen, and it's this constant feedback. And if we look at the soils around here, actually the Midwest, for the most part, you don't need to be fertilizing with phosphorus. In the past they did, but I agree with the state on that one. That was a good move.
Okay.
Let's probably wrap it up.
it?
We got one more speaker, and we'll continue the discussion later on. So.
Well, they'll all be out wandering around.
Yeah. We got one more talk at 11. So let's.
Yes.
Thank our.